let's get started. So at Guidebook, we have always prioritized our design when it comes to creating a product, and particularly our product. We know as creators that one of the most important aspects of using and yes, creating a mobile app is its design. You may have heard terms like user experience and user interface before, but you aren't quite sure what to make of those terms and do they even apply to you? It's an interesting question, and if you're using a platform-based app builder like Guidebook, do you even need to worry about design, or has it already been taken care of for you? Well, the good news is, in large part, yes, Guidebook has done a lot of the heavy lifting on the design front so that you can focus on getting the proper content into your guides. But of course, we always want the apps and guides that you publish to have a look and feel that suits your organization or your event. So we've left some flexible areas that you can take advantage of in order to brand or enhance your content. Today we've got Guidebooks product designers in the house, and you're actually going to hear straight from the people who design apps themselves about how you can take full advantage of Guidebook's platform to make great looking apps. We'll cover some basic principles of app design, and we'll also talk about some tips and tricks that will make sure that when you are presenting information within an app, you'll be able to do it in a way that is most beneficial to your users. So I'm going to jump right over here to our illustrious guests today. First we have Pete Latta on the line. Pete has been designing and developing for the web for over 10 years now. Prior to Guidebook, he operated a boutique design studio out of Palo Alto, and now he is one of Guidebook's co-founders and the creative director. So welcome, Pete. We're glad to have you here today.
Thanks.
We also have Guillermo on the line, or as we call him, Gui. Gui has been working as a product designer specializing in design for web applications, responsive websites, and native mobile applications. Additionally, he provides illustration and iconography for marketing assets and application visual design, and he is one of our product designers. Welcome, Guillermo.
Excited to be here. All
right. And then last but not least, we have Barb Belcito here, one of our senior product designers. And Barb is a product designer who specializes in interaction and user experience design. Her work at Guidebook focuses mostly on iOS and Android design. So a lot of the reason Guidebook looks the way it does is because of Barb. So welcome, Barb. Glad to have you here.
Hi, Jordan. Happy to be here.
Excellent. And then we also have Matthew McHugh on the line, who's one of our customer success associates. And Matthew has been here at Guidebook for the past 2 years. He helps clients build guides that exceed their expectations, and we are happy to have Matthew here today. He's going to talk about a little bit about how you can take some of the design concepts that we talk about and apply them to your own personal guides. So welcome, Matthew.
Thank you, Jordan. It's great to be here. I see a lot of familiar names in the participant list, so hi to everyone.
All right. So let's jump right into it. Let's talk a little bit about just basic design principles, and when it comes to building an app, some of the things that designers have to keep in mind. Pete, I want to kick it off with you. What's the difference between designing for a mobile app versus, say, a website or some other type of digital experience?
Great. Well, hi, guys. Yeah, this is Pete Latta. I'm the creative director here at Guidebook, and that's a great question, Jordan. So one of the biggest differences between native apps and the web, and when I say the web, I'm talking about either mobile web or desktop, is that a native app has access to sort of system-level services that most websites don't. This has really far-ranging implications for how a user can interact with your app and what sort of data or functions your app is able to make use of. So for instance, Guidebook stores all of our data from a guide locally on the device once the guide is initially downloaded. This wouldn't be possible with a website, as most websites don't really have access or a way to store complex data locally, so a true offline mode wouldn't be able to exist. Additionally, things like push messages, which are not possible via a website, reminders, things like logging into an app with credentials stored locally on your device. Think about logging into an app on your phone with your Twitter login that's already stored in the OS. These things are only available to native applications, and this all makes a huge, huge difference in how you plan out the design of the application. Another major difference is sort of the expectation from users about how a native app should look and behave. So with the web, designers are usually forced to adapt a sort of one-size-fits-all approach, which works across desktop browsers of all sizes, even down to responsive web. But the issue here is that it all kind of looks the same no matter what platform you're viewing it on. Another way to say this is it's not really optimized for any specific platform. So with native, on the other hand, as a designer, you're kind of obligated to design each version of your app specific for that platform. So what this means is, adhering to established things like navigation concepts, UI elements, layout patterns, et cetera, which exist within the platform already and which a user is already familiar with. A well-designed app will kind of fit at home within the platform's OS because the sort of elements the user are already familiar with. One of the other major differences is simply the feel of using a native app versus a website. So often animations and UI on the web can be slow and unresponsive, which is often the case because websites have limited access to the computer or phone's GPU and aren't able to get that extra power. It also happens because developers are kind of free to have elements behave basically however they want, and they're free to design things basically in to their heart's content on the web. So it results in sort of extreme differences in behavior of the UI. Native apps, on the other hand, can tap into sort of system defaults, so your app feels, for lack of a better word, like other apps on the platform. Native apps also have access to the phone's GPU, so they're able to feel more smooth and more solid. Those are some of the major differences that we see kind of between native apps and designing for the web.
Pete, and one of the things that I'm hearing you say, I think, is that one of the interesting things about a mobile app is that it allows us to have a much more personal experience with the design. And so when we're thinking about user experience and user interaction, when we're designing for a device that is meant to be carried around in your pocket all day, it truly creates something that can be personal, and it has information stored on your phone already that we can take advantage of. And we know your location, and we can send push notifications which come straight to the home screen of the phone, and in turn give us a much more sort of active experience as opposed to the more an experience on a web browser on a desktop. That's something that you have to seek out. But in many ways, a mobile app can actually reach out to you.
Yeah, no, that's completely right. I think you hit the nail right on the head. Mobile apps can be much more personal, whereas a website experience generally will be a less personal experience.
Excellent. Let's move on to the next question, which is, when you're thinking about creating a mobile app, where do you begin? What are some of the basic things that you have to think about when you're first starting to design an app?
That is a great question, and obviously there's an enormous amount that goes into starting an application, so we're just going to touch on a few things that we kind of think are important here and that would interest you guys. Starting to design an app obviously takes quite a bit of consideration. Before we even jump into Sketch or Photoshop or even starting wireframes, generally the first step that we'll take is to identify who is going to be using this application, and these people are called your end users. Basically, nearly all design decisions you'll make will be made so that the experience of these end users is enhanced. If you're not making design decisions without thinking of this group, it's generally a bad idea and will end up with a worse experience for them. The next thing we do is we kind of think about a few other key components, namely what the most important information we want to display within the app is, what your users will ultimately want to do with your app, like what their goals are, and what the main problem you're trying to solve is. These can be tricky to nail down, but it helps establish a baseline for design decision-making around things like information architecture and navigation flow. So for instance, while designing Interact, which is a feature we released recently, it's kind of a news feed style feature, we determined that there was an issue within Guidebook of accessing relevant content quickly without searching. We wanted information retrieval on Guidebook to basically be as quick and as simple as possible. So this led us to design Interact in a way where users could access Guidebook and rapidly get this at-a-glance view of relevant content, like upcoming sessions, popular photos, recent check-ins, etc. We may not have designed Interact in this way if we didn't identify that core problem early on in the design process. Similarly with Interact, we sort of decided early on that the end user's main goal would be to sort of quickly figure out what's coming up and to post something on the feed. So this allowed us to kind of prioritize those two features within the view and create an experience which made sense for the end user and was enjoyable for them. And this was because their goals really matched and synced up with what we were designing for. So that's kind of how we start the process from the very beginning. I kind of also wanted to talk about a few other things that are important. They're not necessarily first steps, but still important in the process. And that is establishing a visual language, creating a style guide, and creating a component library. So investing in these steps are kind of what set an excellent app apart from a mediocre one. So just to run through these quickly so you guys understand, a visual language is something that dictates the color, the layout, the general aesthetics of your application. It helps sort of establish consistency across views and helps bring the entire app together into one sort of cohesive package. A style guide is similar to that, but it goes into more details, about specific layout information, information architecture decisions, and sort of when and where to use certain colors, how much spacing to give elements, font sizes, etc. A component library is a good sort of last step, is more towards the end of the design phase. But this is essentially a collection of UI elements that you use within your application and how they behave and display when given certain parameters or fall into certain situations. So for instance, on Guidebook, a component we have is a button. So we define that as a component. This component would say what the button looks like when it's tapped or when it's disabled or when it's focused. What this does is it allows components across your entire application to behave the same, which really benefits the user experience. If the user knows what to expect when they interact with the component, that makes the experience much better. So these things kind of all contribute to an excellent final product, and these are some of the early sort of design steps we take when you're starting a new application.
Great, and one of the most important things I think, Pete, about this is no matter what, when you're coming up with content, whether it's the design of an app or the content of an app, you should always keep in mind the consideration of who is this for, what is your audience, and how are they going to be interacting with this. And that allows you to create hierarchies and priorities in terms of what exactly it is that you want to communicate to people and how you want to communicate with them. And then I think it's not out of the question that even our Guidebook users should be thinking about establishing visual languages and creating component libraries, even if it's in a small way. Branding your organization or your event and having consistency is an important part of a digital experience. And so, those components of Guidebook which are customizable, such as banners and icons, and even the way you lay out your menu, are all things that should be kept in mind in terms of things that you can brand, things that demand consistency. And the more thought you put into that, the more of a holistic mobile experience that your users are going to be having. All right, another question for Pete. When it comes to designing an app, what are some of the stumbling blocks or things that people might trip over, especially to people who haven't necessarily had to consider the layout of a mobile app before?
Yeah, that's another great question, and we could sit here and talk about common pitfalls for hours, but just a few of the ones that kind of crop up pretty often that we see as a design team that I wanted to call out. Poor information architecture is one of the biggest ones, and this is a huge issue within complex applications. It's something we have to deal with, and find remedies to at Guidebook on a near daily basis, given how large and complex our app has become. But to put it simply, as a designer, you need to think about sort of what the user will find relevant on any given view within the application, and similarly, what you're able to get away with hiding from that view. So basically, if there's too much information available on a single view, or if it's laid out poorly, or if it's too dense, the user's not able to digest that information easily. Similarly, if there's too little information, it can have an equally bad effect. So this all affects user experience, and if information architecture is poor, the user experience is generally going to be poor. Affordances are another thing. So affordances, for those who don't know, are things that give users sort of an indication of what will happen when they interact with something in your UI. So for instance, you could take a drop-down menu, and it will likely have a little arrow next to it indicating that when you tap that drop-down menu, a list will appear. You'll have some items you can select from. A common pitfall for poorly designed apps is basically missing or unclear affordances, which can basically lead to user confusion and frustration. So in the drop-down I just mentioned, you can imagine if there was no arrow and there was no border and it was just text, it would be unclear if that was a label, or if you did tap it, what would be the expected behavior. And this causes users to guess, they feel unsure about themselves, and it causes user confusion, which is something we really want to avoid. Another one that's kind of a pet peeve of our design team here, just because we see it pretty often, even within Guidebook, because since there's so much user-generated content, it's sort of unclear labeling and icons. So, just to put a fine point on it, labels and icons should directly refer to the element they're associated with, and basically as clear and concise language as possible. So often we see labels which don't, precisely describe the action they're labeling, or icons which don't match that label at all. This all leads to user confusion. one that I've seen a few times, which is confusing, is like on iOS you might see an alert dialog with some text and two options, two buttons below that say no thanks or cancel, which both sound like they should be doing the same thing, but they're maybe slightly different, but who knows. So example of bad labeling. A final big pitfall that we see pretty often is taking existing paradigms of the operating system or paradigms that you've established even within your own internal style guide and using them inappropriately. So this, again, contributes to user confusion, bad experience. A good example of this is, I've seen this on iOS a few times, is tapping the native back button, yet the view sort of slides down or closes like it was an overlay or a modal or something, which is not the expected behavior of back, and it, again, throws the user off and causes confusion. And this is a small thing, but it hurts. So these are all kind of, some common pitfalls that we see pretty often happening on sort of many apps throughout the App Store.
Great. And, Pete, I think that especially things such as unclear labeling and, even things as simple as breaking paradigms, when users are actually loading information to their own guidebook guides and apps, they can, despite our best efforts to create exquisite design, it can often go off the rails if the content hasn't been thought out well. So it's important to continue to take these things into consideration as you're loading your own content as well. One more question for Pete.
Sure.
How has, now that we've talked about some of these basic design principles, how has Guidebook taken advantage of these over the past few years and built them into their own personal design?
Yeah, so that's great. We've talked a lot about sort of these basic principles, but yeah, let's talk a little bit about how Guidebook kind of deploys these principles within our application. So, number one, I think Guidebook has these deep system-level integrations with things like push messages for reminders, local storage for offline viewing, GPS for nearby guides. So I really think we're taking advantage of being a native app and really doing a lot more than what we could if we were simply a website. As we showed a few slides ago, we have a fully fleshed out style guide, visual language component library, and we use these for literally every new feature we design. We adhere to platform UI paradigms, and by this I mean we design UI specific for each platform, not the one-size-fits-all approach which I talked about earlier. Additionally, we empathize with and we spend time thinking about the end user and their goals before designing even little features within Guidebook. We spend time thinking about this. And finally, we pay really strong attention to information architecture. It's something we're really cognizant of, and we know that it's necessary for us to thrive given how complex Guidebook has become. So I think these are the ways we kind of take those core principles and have applied them to Guidebook, the platform.
Great. I'd love to now jump into kind of what makes mobile apps unique, and maybe some of the features that we've built into our platform that our users